Hi, I'm Josh, and I am very grateful that you actually clicked play on one of my book reviews. How much of it you actually watch is up to you, but that's why I divide my video up into chapters so you can skip all the parts you're not interested in and get straight to the good stuff. I'm recording this video on Thursday, July 11th, and here I am to talk about a book called Cordelia's Honor by Lois McMaster Bujold, and this is actually a bind-up of two books from a series called the Vorkosigan Saga, a science fiction series by Lois McMaster Bujold. The first book that is in here is called Shards of Honor, and the second one is called Barrayer. I'm going to give a quick introduction to this series. I'm going to go into some depth about the writing in the books. And then going to get just very, very briefly into the plot and characters. I'm going to talk about some good points that I pulled out of these books and then kind of finish up with some ratings. So let's get straight into all that. My reason for getting into the Vorkosigan Saga is mainly due to the fact that The Curse of Chalion by Lois McMaster Bujold is my #1 favorite fantasy novel of all time. And then the next book in that, it was not a series, it's a standalone that takes place in the same world and a few years after the events of The Curse of Chalion. But Paladin of Souls, I read it. I thought it was also an excellent book. It wasn't a perfect 10 out of 10 like The Curse of Chalion was. I think I rated this one an 8.5 out of 10. But the point is, I read those books. I was blown away by the story, by the writing, and thought Lois McMaster Bujold is an author who I would love to explore some more. And so I thought I would check out her sci-fi series, the Vorkosigan Saga. Now, I'm going to get to this in a second, but the first thing that struck me when I started into this book was the writing quality was terrible. As it turns out, from further research, the first book that I read in here, Shards of Honor, is the first novel that Lois McMaster Bujold ever wrote. And so what we see here is a progression from the first book from an author to a book that came some years down the road, and we see this amazing progression that she took as an author with her skills, with her craft. And it really kind of surprised me, though, just the low quality of writing that we are starting out with here. And I was actually unsure which book to start with the series, because when you look on GoodReads and you look at all the books, there's quite a few. There's something like 14 or so full novels, I believe, in this series, but the chronological order of the events of the stories is different than the publication order. So, like I said, Shards of Honor is the first book that Lois McMaster Bujold wrote. However, chronologically, a book called Falling Free, which was written in 1988, is the first book in the internal chronology. Shards of Honor, published in 1986, is the second one in chronology. The one that follows it, Barrayer, here is the third one in chronology, but it was written in 1991, several years after some of the other books in the chronological order. So book 4 in chronological order was The Warrior's Apprentice, published again in 1986, so going back to the same year that Shards of Honor was written. Then book 5, The War Game, was in 1990, and then as we continue into book 6 and 7, we go back in years again, so we're kind of jumping back and forth in time. It's a little bit confusing where to begin. In doing my research, it seemed like the first few books in the series were maybe we're skipping, and initially I was going to jump in at The Warrior's Apprentice, which is where the starting story of a character called Miles comes into play, and I think he becomes one of the main characters in the series going forward. However, other people suggested that I start at Shards of Honor, that I just skip Falling Free altogether and start with book 2, Shards of Honor, because with that we are introduced to Miles's parents and we learn how Miles came into being, and we learn about his family background. So I decided to follow that advice and start with Shards of Honor and book 2, Barrayer, or book 3, Barrayer, that were bound up together in Cordelia's Honor. So does that make any sense, or have I confused everybody? I will add that I was able to pick up this used book thanks to my Patreon supporters. I used some of my Patreon money for the month and went and ordered a used copy of Cordelia's Honor online. So thank you to my Patreon supporters for the gift of this particular book, especially to my highest tier supporter, Osmondus Pervect, who went and increased his monthly Patreon pledge yet again for like the third or fourth time. So, Osmondus, I really am not deserving of your generosity, but I appreciate it, and I'm very, very grateful. So let's get into the first aspect of this book, which is the writing. Like I mentioned, I was really surprised by the poor quality of the writing that I came across after deciding that Lois McMaster Bujold is my #1 favorite fantasy author. Now, she is an amazing writer. The writing of these books is top-notch. I mean, there are other fantasy writers who I feel are really amazing writers from a technical viewpoint. Authors like Laini Taylor, Joe Abercrombie, Guy Gavriel Kay, T. Kingfisher. There's some really excellent writers in the fantasy genre, despite what I would say is generally a fairly low bar for writing quality within the genre. That might be controversial, I don't know. But yeah, starting into Shards of Honor here, I was like, whoa, this is a beginning author, and it shows. The three main things I'm going to look at when I talk about the writing are things I've talked about in previous book reviews. So I'm basically talking about these because writing interests me, learning how to write well interests me, and so I'm doing this for the benefit of for other people who are interested in learning how to write well. If you have no interest in that, just skip right along to the next section. That's why I divide up my videos into chapters here. But yeah, I definitely have talked about these things in my reviews of Guns of the Dawn by Adrian Tchaikovsky, and that 4-book series that I'm completely blanking on, I'll put on the screen here. But oh yeah, so the three things I'm looking at primarily when I'm looking at talking about the quality of writing here are, first of all, dialogue tags, secondly, adverbs, and thirdly, similes. But just one little thing before I get into that, which I see over and over again with these fantasy authors. It's talking about a dead man, and it talks about his last look of surprise frozen on his face. And authors just love to have their dead people with these frozen expressions of fear and surprise, as if when a person's heart stops beating, it just freezes them in place in the instant of death, as if they're a robot that has just had the power shut off or something. That's not how death works. I've had the unfortunate experience of watching people die as a paramedic, and typically what will happen is when the heart stops beating and the brain loses oxygen, typically they'll have a seizure. They'll kind of go out all stiff as the hypoxia causes their brain to kind of misfire, and then they'll gradually relax, and the full body, all the muscles in the body will completely relax, and they're definitely not frozen in surprise in death. But let's talk about dialogue tags, and the main thing that any good writer needs to know is the word said should carry most of your heavy lifting with dialogue tags. He said, she said. You might throw in the occasional asked, he asked, or shouted or whispered or something else a little bit here and there, but he said, she said should be your main dialogue tags here. And I'm going to show you why, because when you start trying to get kind of fancy with that stuff, it just starts to sound a little bit awkward. Here are a few examples from dialogues that are taking place within the book. What'll I be looking at when I get to the bottom? She quizzed Nelissa. My question is here, how many questions does a person have to ask for it to be a quiz? I guess one question can be a quiz. The next one here, that damned poison, the doctor bitched. Really? That's what you're going to use instead of said? As if the doctor complaining about somebody being poisoned is him bitching? Come on now. So, yeah, we'll get to a couple other examples when we combine them with the adverbs that I'm going to get to. And people who talk about how to write well, like Stephen King in his book called On Writing, talk about how adverbs should be used very sparingly because your readers are smart people, and they should be treated as such. When you throw in a lot of overly descriptive adverbs, what you're doing is you are saying that your reader doesn't understand how things are being done in the book, so it needs to be overly explained to them. And again, here's a couple of examples to show how awkward it can be. Pain exploded through her head in radiating lines. She groaned inarticulately. I mean, can you groan articulately? Could have just said she groaned. I don't know why the groaning has to be inarticulate specifically. Cordelia fastened the tabs to his collar straightly with the greatest care and stepped back to admire her work. Is that even a word? Straightly? I mean, we assume that if you're helping a person dress up, you're doing it so that it doesn't look all awkward and crooked. But straightly? Now here are a few examples that you can see when you combine these dialogue tags that aren't just said, along with the adverbs. You can see how doubly awkward everything ends up sounding here. So we have two characters talking to each other. "Are you in very much pain?" asked Cordelia diffidently. "Not much," Kudelka tossed off. Again, diffidently doesn't need to be there. Could have just been asked Cordelia and then tossed off instead of said. Very, very weird. Next conversation here. "Thank you, Izar," Cordelia murmured wryly. "Once we're out of Izar's passage, the real risk starts," the girl commented. So, murmured wryly, Cordelia said, would have been just fine there. And then the girl commented. For one thing, the girl here is actually a very strong adult female who is a bodyguard type of character. So very strong, very smart. And here she's, for some reason, referred to as the girl. And the girl commented. Kind of unfortunate. Another conversation. "I'm surprised they didn't have you hanged." "There was a great uproar behind closed doors," he admitted reminiscently, fingering his collar tabs. He admitted reminiscently. Again, this is the author overly explaining something that's obvious based on the context of what's being said. He said would have been just fine there. Next one. "That's very good," he applauded, gratified. He said. We know he's gratified because of what he's saying. You don't have to overly explain that for us. And then the last example here contains a terrible example of an adverb, as well as just a lot of adjectives in kind of an overly descriptive scene. We have, "The sun was sinking yellowly in a gray bank of clouds, and lights were beginning to glow in the cool, damp autumn evening, giving the city a somber, melancholy atmosphere." Now, I'm all for adjectives really bringing the descriptions to life, but when you have two adjectives per verb, plus this crazy use of yellowly for the sunset, it's just not good writing, is what it comes down to. Now, we'll go on to similes, and the wonderful thing about similes is that they can really give the reader a relatable thing that helps to contextualize what's being described. So we can really put ourselves into whatever it is that is being narrated in the story through something that is relatable to us. Now, if the simile is completely unrelatable, then we run into some weird situations. Here's a couple of examples. "Cordelia's hand spasmed like a dying runner's giving up the baton in some mortal relay race." There's really nothing more relatable than being in a mortal relay race, and as you're dying, giving up the baton with your spasming hands. That's something we can all relate to, I'm sure. Here's the next one. "Still, she was bothered by a subliminal alarm, a persistent sense of something of importance forgotten. It popped out of her memory suddenly, like a ball held underwater, breaking the surface on release and arcing into the air." That's a really overly descriptive way of saying she remembered something. No, it popped out of her head like a ball popping out of the water. Here's another very relatable simile. She felt hollow. Energy, will, desire slipped through her fingers like shining liquid sucked away through some infinite sand. Yes, that shining liquid that we're all so familiar with that gets sucked away through sand. That's definitely what it feels like to have your energy and will be sucked out of you, I guess. The last one here, Cordelia's own soul felt like an exhausted snail, shelled in a glassy numbness. She crept like an automaton through the rest of the ceremony. So, you know, we can all relate to being an exhausted snail with a glassy, numb shell around us, I'm sure. I mean, the good thing was the second simile that immediately followed it was pretty good. She crept like an automaton through the rest of the ceremony. That one definitely makes sense from a story perspective, I suppose. And I'll just wrap up with one metaphor here. So we'll take a little side step from similes and talk about a metaphor. She knelt beside the table, putting her head down a moment to fight the blood-drained black balloons that clouded her vision and threatened to empty her mind of consciousness. So instead of saying that she was lightheaded, the author gave us the relatable example of balloons that are filled with blood being drained out, and then these balloons that are drained of blood now clouding her vision. I have no words, really. I mean, yeah, I mean, some of us, I'm sure, can relate to kind of getting to that point of blackout where your vision starts to go a little black and stuff, but I'm not sure where blood-filled balloons come into play here. But let's end this section on writing on a positive note, because Lois McMaster Bujold wrote an afterword to the novel where she talks about a couple of interesting things, and I really appreciate that she put it in as an afterword, because I read so many books that have a foreword by the author that talk about the book. Either the author or an editor is talking about the book and the story, but it makes no sense if you are not familiar, if you haven't yet read the book. So what I usually end up doing is I'll read the book, then I will come back and read the foreword so that what is being said makes sense to me and so that I don't spoil any of the story. And so I really appreciated it when Lois McMaster Bujold started off the afterword with this paragraph. I was asked by my publisher if I would like to contribute a preface to Cordelia's honor. Upon reflection, I decided I'd rather write an afterword. For one thing, it was a horrifying thought that anything at all should further delay new readers from meeting my characters. Secondly, discursive comments about a book make ever so much more sense after people have read it. That's exactly why I appreciate this afterword here. Also, by the time she got around to writing this afterwards, some years after publishing the book, she had really become a much better author. And so when she's talking about her writing process, then at this point, I can really appreciate what she has to say much more. I really like, in particular, this comment she made about how to write a character-centric novel. And again, that's one thing I really love about her fantasy novels are the characters. I mean, the character in The Curse of Chalion here is one of my #1 favorite fantasy characters of all time. Well, #1 favorite, possibly is my favorite fantasy character, is one of my #1 fictional characters of all time. But anyways, she's talking about the process of writing this sci-fi book, and she thought about putting in this kind of scene that would make it easier for her to continue writing the story. But then she asked herself, why should I make things easy on my characters? And I plunged on to the much better and more inherent idea of, spoiler to the plot, thus accidentally discovering my first application of the rule for finding plots for character-centered novels, which is to ask, so what's the worst possible thing I can do to this guy? And then do it. So, great advice for writing character-centric novels. Do your absolute worst to your characters and see how they manage to survive and get through it. Putting the writing aside now, just a very brief talk about the plot of these two books. Essentially, the first book starts off with a scientist who has found herself stranded on a planet that she has come to explore. At the same time, an enemy from a different planet has ended up in the same location and has taken her captive. Both of them have ended up stranded on this planet, but she has been taken captive by this other guy from another planet. The rest of the book, for the most part, is the two of them journeying through the planet, trying to get to a place of safety and getting to know each other in the process. I think it's only a very minor spoiler to say that the characters fall in love, because that forms the foundation for what happens as the series goes forward. So getting into the second book, now we have these two characters who are working together now, not as enemies. They are partnered together in a political situation on the man's planet. So he has found himself in a high political position, and he's having to deal with a lot of conflict and turmoil that's happening in an unstable political environment, including conflicts off planet as well as conflicts on the planet. And the two of them are having to work through that while also dealing with a pregnancy that has some significant problems associated with it. And that pregnancy is ultimately what is going to bring Miles into play for book 3, apparently. But that's all I'm going to say about the plots, because like I said, I really don't like to get into it because I don't like to spoil things. The characters themselves, though, are where I had a little bit of an issue. I really liked the lady who was kind of the number one character, Cordelia here. She was a really cool character. She was a scientist who was kind of forced by circumstances to become a politician, to a soldier to a certain extent, roles in which she was very uncomfortable, but that she was forced into through circumstances, and she had to kind of make the best out of a position that she really didn't want to be in. So she was a very strong, very smart character, a fun one to follow. So at least the main character in these two books was a character that I could kind of connect with and enjoy. Now, the male half of the two main characters, a guy named Vorkosigan, I did not really like all that much. He was, whereas she was a scientist, he was the soldier politician. Wasn't really much into this guy. In fact, I think the biggest problem I had with the first book here, besides the terrible writing, was the fact that these two characters fell in love with each other almost instantly, and I just got thinking, why does she love her captor, especially this hardened soldier dude who is completely different than she is? I couldn't understand this sort of enemy to lover situation that developed, and I don't really see what there was there that she could so instantly fall in love with, unless he was a strikingly handsome man, and it describes that he wasn't especially handsome. So what it was in him and his personality that she really fell for so hard is something that I never really was able to figure out, and one of the big problems I had. And here's just a really quick example of why I didn't like the guy. So Cordelia and Vorkosigan are having an argument, and by way of not really apology, he says to her, "Oh, it's the damn job, I expect. I didn't mean to spill it on you." Cordelia suspected that this was as near as she could expect of an admission of his being in the wrong, and accepted it with a little nod, letting her own rage evaporate. And again, I'm like, so she knows that he's never going to admit that he's wrong. This wasn't an apology, and yet she's like, "Oh, you're good, you're fine. I don't feel any more anger towards you." And I just don't get that dynamic, you know? As for the rest of the characters, one of the issues I had too was in book 2 especially, once they were on this particular planet, the nobility of the planet were called the Vor, because all of their surnames started with VOR. So we have Vorkosigan here as one of the characters, and we have all of these other characters that have slight variations on the Vor surname: Vordalia, Vardarian, Vorkosigan. And so I kept being like, all of these people are blending together for me. I can't really keep track of who is who here. So yeah, overall the characters Great main character. Everybody else, yeah, not so awesome. But before I get to the ratings, let's end with some positive stuff. So let's look at some good points in the book that relate to government, war, and death, and then some other good points that I can more personally relate to. So let's start on the topic of government here. And this is sort of Cordelia thinking to herself about the government of this strange planet, strange to her planet, that she has ended up on. The strangeness of the Barrayer government system, with all its unwritten customs, pressed on Cordelia not so much at first glance, but gradually. And yet it seemed to work for them somehow. They made it work, pretending a government into existence. Perhaps all governments were such consensus fictions at their hearts. And isn't that the truth? We all have to pretend that our government's working and that they're working for us and that they are chosen by us, which is all pretty far from the accurate situation of things, I think. Very closely tied to that, we have this statement here talking about the people we traditionally think as criminals versus who the real criminals are. We have a man who is talking about another character, Vorkosigan. He was just a little villain, an old-fashioned craftsman making crimes one-off. The really unforgivable acts are committed by calm men in beautiful green silk rooms, who deal death wholesale by the shipload, without lust or anger or desire or any redeeming emotion to excuse them but cold fear of some pretended future. But the crimes they hope to commit in that future are imaginary. The ones they commit in the present, they are real. And if the government can get the rest of the population to fear something, then they can all that much more easily excuse their atrocities. Then there's this comment related to war that I wholeheartedly agree with as well. We have Vorkosigan talking to Cordelia. "Women shouldn't be in combat," said Vorkosigan, grimly glum. Grimly glum. There's another adverb for you. Anyways, "Women shouldn't be in combat. Neither should men, in my opinion." And that's the truth. Nobody should be in combat. What are we doing? None of the combatants are benefiting from anything that's happening there. Related to that, I appreciate that Cordelia takes the following comment as an insult here. A man says to Cordelia, "You think like a soldier, milady." Cly sounded approving. Cordelia wrinkled her brow in dismay. What an appalling compliment. The last thing she wanted was to start thinking like a soldier, playing their game by their rules. The hallucinatory military worldview was horribly infectious, though, immersed in it as she was now. How long can I tread water? Again, I like that she was appalled by that compliment. And we talk about those young soldiers who end up dying in battle. And actually, one of the characters I really liked was this med tech, whose job it was, after a space battle, to go to the sector and pull all the bodies she could find out of outer space and give them proper treatments and burials and so forth. And in this case, she's working with another young co-worker who isn't particularly fond of the fact that she's spending the same amount of time on the enemy soldiers as she is on the friendly soldiers of their side. And so the young man says, in reference to one of the bodies of the enemy soldiers, "I still think he ought to be dumped with the rest of the garbage." "Not at all," said the medtech. "Think of all the work he represents on somebody's part. 9 months of pregnancy, childbirth, 2 years of diapering, and that's just the beginning. Tens of thousands of meals, thousands of bedtime stories, years of school, dozens of teachers, and all that military training too. A lot of people went into making him." She smoothed a strand of the corpse's hair into place. "That head held the universe once. He had a good rank for his age," she added, rechecking her monitor. 32. Commander Aristidi Vorkolinar. It has a kind of nice ethnic ring, very Barrayer-ish, that name. Vor, too, one of those warrior-class fellows. "Homicidal-class loonies, or worse," Farrell said automatically, but his vehemence had lost momentum somehow. Bonnie shrugged. "Well, he's joined the great democracy now." It really does bring into focus what a waste it is for even one young man to die in battle, one young woman to die in battle. How much is lost, not just for the person who dies, but for everybody left behind as well. And Cordelia is thinking along similar lines here later on. She preferred her military history with more temporal displacement, a century or two in the past, say. She imagined some cool future scholar looking through a time telescope at her and gave him a mental rude gesture. Anyway, she now realized, the military histories she'd read had left out the most important part. They never told what happened to people's babies. No, they were all babies out there. Every mother's son in a black uniform. One of Viral's reminiscences floated up in her memory, velvet voice rumbling, "It was about that time that soldiers started looking like children to me." But we'll go back to that med tech for the last word here on this topic. And it's one reason why I didn't mind, for the most part, working with dead people as a paramedic. On the other hand, it's one reason that led to my PTSD. So the medtech Bonnie says to the young man, "Don't be afraid. The dead cannot hurt you. They give you no pain except that of seeing your own death in their faces. And one can face that, I find." And that's true. I can face my own mortality in the dead people I've dealt with as a paramedic. The part that I could not handle mentally was seeing my own children's death in the dead babies and dead toddlers and young children that I dealt with. And that's ultimately what broke my brain and resulted in the PTSD. So that naturally leads us into some other things that I could relate to that I enjoyed reading in the book here. And actually, it just occurred to me that we're still with our med tech for this quote here, who says, "I rather like going through the pockets of the dead," she remarked. "It reminds me of when I was a little girl visiting in someone else's home. When I went upstairs by myself to go to the bathroom or whatever, it was always a kind of pleasure to peek into the other rooms and see what kind of things they had and how they kept them. If they were very neat, I was always very impressed. I've never been able to keep my own things neat. If it was a mess, I felt I'd found a secret kindred spirit. A person's things can be a kind of exterior morphology of their mind, like a snail's shell or something. And for me, it's almost the opposite, whereas they're saying that the things you have and your exterior surroundings are a morphology of your mind. For me, it's if I can keep the things around me neat and clean and tidy, it can help my inner brain feel more relaxed, more calm. And same with just not having a lot of stuff in general, just not filling my house with junk, just living simply. I mean, there is one good side to just not having money is you can't just keep buying junk and cluttering up the space around you, which then clutters your own mind. So it's almost a reverse effect for my own experience. Going back to the topic of children, here's something I agree with. Children might or might not be a blessing, but to create them and then fail them was surely damnation. And that's why we have so many problems, is because everything starts with childhood. Every single person who is living in our streets, who is addicted to drugs, talk to them about their childhood and you'll hear horrible stories. Not everybody who has success in life had a good childhood, but pretty much everybody who is struggling immensely in life did have a pretty terrible childhood. Going back to my paramedic work again, one of Vorkosigan's associates here is admonishing him and could definitely be saying the same thing to me. Why can't you just lose your temper with subordinates like normal men instead of with superiors like a lunatic? And yeah, that was me. If I ever lost my temper, it was with one of my supervisors, and that was not so great for my upward mobility in my career, which, yeah, I certainly never tried to get into management positions, but I mean, I very vividly recalling yelling at one of my supervisors to F off multiple times at the end of a night shift. Whereas my other co-workers and whatnot, I treated very politely and kindly. So yeah, not the smartest thing from a career point of view. What's interesting about the next quote here is the fact that I lasted just over 15 years in my job before I ended up on disability. And so we have here, Ralph Vorkosigan, thinking about the position he's in, the difficult job he has, the difficult decisions he has to make daily, and he says, and this is only the beginning. Every month, every week, there will be some other impossible thing. What's going to be left of me after 15 years of this? A husk like the thing we buried 3 months ago, praying with his last breath that there may be no God? Yeah, probably. And then on the topic of disability, especially as it relates to disabled soldiers / first responders perhaps, we have this talking about how this particular planet handles people with disabilities. And Vorkosigan is teaching Cordelia how they handle things. He's talking about how they kind of eliminate any life form that has detectable malformations, I guess, anytime after conception. So Vorkosigan says any problems that are detectable are eliminated before birth. Well, we do that too, though usually before conception, also at birth, and after in the backcountry. Oh, as for maimed adults, good heavens, you don't practice euthanasia on them, do you? Your ensign Dubauer would not have lived here. Dubauer had taken disruptor fire to the head and survived, sort of. As for injuries like Kudelka's, or worse, the social stigma is very great. Watch him in a larger group sometime, not his close friends. It's no accident that the suicide rate among medically discharged soldiers is high. That's horrible. Unfortunately, the highest suicide rates in our society are from combat veterans and paramedics, interestingly enough. And last time I was researching it, I think paramedics had the lead there, so yeah, winning. We'll continue these cheery thoughts with one thing that, again, is extremely relatable. Cordelia talking about life in general. She says, most days it's just stumbling around in the dark with the rest of creation, smashing into things and wondering why it hurts. That's life in a nutshell, isn't it? And then the final thing here, we have a man who is terminally ill, and he's talking to another person saying, I recall from your file that you are some sort of theist, he said. I am an atheist myself. A simple faith, but a great comfort to me in these last days. And I love that, because people don't often look at atheism as the belief system of comfort, but it's provided way more comfort to me, I think, than at any time when I was a theist. So I appreciated that this fellow was dying with the comfort of knowing that there is no God. Isn't that nice? You can just slip into oblivion and not have to worry about a thing. Is that too dark for YouTube? I don't know. I'm just trying to be real with you here. So after all that, what are the ultimate ratings that I give to this author whose books I have rated 10 out of 10 and 8.5 out of 10? Well, unfortunately, the first book of this bind-up was Shards of Honor, and ultimately I'm going to have to give that a 3.5 out of 10. Like I said, the writing was downright bad. The story didn't make sense to me, that these characters were falling in love with each other. And overall, just I was not interested in the book very much. Moving on to Barrayer, the second book in the Cordelia's Honor bind-up, the writing did improve. Now, like I said, it was written 5 years after Shards of Honor, even though it slots into book 3 of the series here. And so there's definite improvement in the writing. Now, some of the examples I gave of bad writing did come from Barrayer as well, so it's certainly not perfect. It's not up to the standards of her later fantasy books, but the writing's improved, the story is more interesting, but ultimately still not there for me personally. I only ended up giving it a 5.5 out of 10. The characters for the most part weren't overly compelling. The story was kind of interesting, but didn't really take me in enough to really be coming out back to this book night after night. I guess if you want to talk about Cordelia's Honor as a whole, the average between those two ratings would be 4.5 out of 10, but really they're two books that are part of a larger series. And for smaller series, duologies, trilogies, even 4-book series, I generally like to rate them all as one rating one story. But because these books are written so far apart and the series is so long, it makes more sense to rate each book individually in this case, I think. And as for going on with the rest of the Vorkosigan Saga, you know, I think I'd probably like to at least read The Warrior's Apprentice, the book that I was originally going to start out with, to see what things are like with this new character, Miles Vorkosigan, and see what I think of that. The thing that's kind of making me hesitate, though, is that book was written in 1986 as well, the same year that Shards of Honor was published. So I'm worried that we're going to take a big back step back to the terrible writing again with The Warrior's Apprentice, and I don't know if it's going to be worth the while to keep building up the foundation for a series that might eventually get really good. I already feel like I kind of wasted my time on the early books in the series, and kind of wish I had just kind of stuck with Lois McMaster Bujold's fantasy books. I mean, she does have other books in this world that are, again, more standalone-ish, I believe. They're not a directly connected series, but they're out there too. So I don't know, maybe at some point I'll come back to The Warrior's Apprentice and give it a shot, or I might just abandon the series altogether. I'm not exactly sure what I'll end up doing. Have you read this series? Is it worth continuing, in your opinion? I'd love to hear about that. I'd also be really interested in hearing what you've been reading lately. Are there any books that you've been especially enjoying? I'd love it if you would get into the comments and let me know, and we can talk about books. That's a fun thing to do. That's why I'm here. And thank you for watching. Cheers. Having hair is a pain. Bring back the hawk. In chronology, for now, you might throw it. Here's a few examples of characters who are speaking. Here's a few examples of, as in books like. Now, here's one that combines when they, you can see how just doubly awkward everything ends up. Still, she was bothered by a subliminal. Cordelia suspected that this was as near as she could expect of an admission of his being